the Russians blocking humanitarian corridors, stopping food, water, and medical supplies from getting to cities that need them. We've heard reports of Russian troops firing on those humanitarian convoys in the past. And of course, as we just saw with our own eyes, those images of a maternity hospital being bombed out by the Russian Air Force.
Yeah, it's just scenes of horror. There's no other way to describe these other than war crimes. But this is what Russians do. This is what Vladimir Putin does. It's what he did in Aleppo. It's what the Russians did in Grozny. This is what they do because this is all they're capable of doing. David, I do wonder, though. You see these scenes of horror. You see Lavrov agreeing to a meeting. Which is about as high of a level as the Russians can give, something they weren't willing to do 2 weeks ago when they began this invasion, when they thought it was quick. And you hear the lies, and you hear Lavrov saying they expect nothing but total surrender. Lavrov knows the Ukrainians will never surrender to them, and he knows, as Putin knows, as every military strategist knows in the world, they've lost this war. They're not going to win this war. And that's not being Pollyannish. That's just, you talk to any military strategist, they're not going to ever be able to subdue this country. So it does sound to me like the Russians, I may not be desperate for a peace still, but they are trying to make the situation as horrifying to the Ukrainians as they can to drive them to the table, to get that agreement on neutrality and to get that agreement on Crimea and to get that agreement on Donbass. And, of course, you have the Ukrainians going in the opposite direction, saying, no, now we're going to take back Crimea. We're going to take that back Donbass.
Moving the goalposts.
This really does sound like two sides that may be trying to find a way to get together.
So we keep talking about exit ramps, and it may be that the ultimate exit ramp for Vladimir Putin is defeat over a long term. I want to ask Admiral Stavridis, who's studied war all his life, what choices he thinks Vladimir Putin has. And specifically, Admiral, I want to ask you about what choices he has in terms of escalation. One thing that I think all of us are concerned about is that facing this blockage in Ukraine, he could choose to escalate into different domains. There's concern that he could use chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. There's concern, obviously, that he could use the ultimate weapon, nuclear weapons. Do you think those fears of escalation are realistic, and how do you think we should respond to them?
Top of my list is cyber. I am very concerned that Putin will reach for, if you will, David, horizontal escalation, take the conflict outside the borders of Ukraine using cyber. And in sort of ascending order of targets he'll go after, as the sanctions put pain on his population, he will try and use cyber to put pain on our population. So potentially he could go after gasoline networks like the Colonial Pipeline hack. He could go after food chains here. Moving up a notch, he could go after transportation. Think air control. Think train management as it moves across the country, both here and in Europe. Thirdly, he could go after financial institutions. Those are very well protected. They're harder targets than the first two I mentioned. At the high end of the scale, potentially he could go after government, command and control, military, again, very hard targets. He will probably choose not to do that as the Russian state, but issue, if you will, letters of marque to these cyber gangs. Probably that's the model that was behind, for example, the ransomware attack on our gasoline network. So picture high gas prices on top of, oh, you can't even get gas. That's the way I think he'll try and do the escalation. In terms of nuclear, I think that's very unlikely. He is not seeking the apocalypse here. I think he's angry, bitter, upset, deeply disappointed in his military, but I don't think he's crazy or irrational. So look for cyber. And then finally, the gas and the biologics. Hey, just for the record, I was Supreme Allied Commander for NATO. The U.S. has no biological chemical weapons. In Europe, we don't do that. We're out of that. And he will try and plant that false flag. But David, bottom line, I'm watching cyber.
And on the cyber front, Nika, in the last call between Biden and Putin, when there was talk about cyber attacks, of course, Biden let Putin know how many pipelines to the number that Russia had, and in his own way said those are nice pipelines. It'd be a shame if something happened to them.
And I don't know if you saw yesterday, there was an intriguing story that came out of Finland, that the Finnish government is reporting that planes flying near the Finnish border and the Russian enclave of Kaliningrad have reported that their GPSs have been interfered with. And that started after the Finnish president met Biden on Saturday here in Washington to talk about expanding Finland's ties with NATO.
And so, Admiral, I mean, as we look at pipelines and bombs and chemical warfare and all these different options on the table that Putin has and what the world can do as a response, I still think about getting to the hearts of the Russian people. Like if you look at the scenes from the maternity ward, you look at the video that came out of the blown up maternity ward of women in labor being carried off, babies being obliterated. If that information could get to the Russian people, there is no Russian woman who would stand by that and think that is okay. And I wonder what is the ability to win on that front, being able to get to the Russian people with the real information as to what is going on?
Well, we are a long way from needing to have CIA agents running around inside the country with the mimeograph machines, which half the audience doesn't know what I'm talking about, mimeograph machines. You know, those days are gone. And so, yes, over time, I am certain what I'm seeing on my cell phone is going to bleed into Moscow, into St. Petersburg, into the more sophisticated levels of the Russian population. I think it's going to be a while until it can get down to the level where it creates the kind of visceral response across the entire population you're describing. But you're right. We are not only in a kinetic battle here, rockets, bombs, tanks. We are not only in a potential cyber conflict, we are in an information conflict. And bottom line here, you know, people say to me sometimes, oh, Admiral, you're right. It's a war of ideas. Kind of. It's really a marketplace of ideas. We're going to win this, but we got to compete in that marketplace. We got to get our ideas out there, and we have the technical capability to do that. Last thought, for any Swedes or Finns who are listening, please join NATO. Ask us on Wednesday. We'll have you in on Friday. They are that good.
Hey, thanks so much for watching our YouTube channel. You can follow up on today's top stories and breaking news, or catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.